The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, painting thin stripes of gold across the kitchen tiles. Everything looked calm for a moment, until the sharp shatter of ceramic broke the quiet. A cup lay in jagged pieces on the floor, and beside it stood Daniel, 9 years old, frozen with fear. His small hands trembled, his breath caught in his throat. He already knew what would follow. Karen's footsteps came fast, clicking against the hardwood as she entered the room. Her arms crossed tightly, her face hard. "What did you do now?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut. It slipped," Daniel stammered, his voice fragile, almost too small to hear. "Slipped?" Karen snapped, stepping closer. "Your father works all day to put food on this table, and you think you can just break things. Do you think money grows on trees?" Daniel's heart pounded. He tried to speak, but fear stole the words from his lips. She struck his arm, not enough to knock him down, but enough to sting and leave him shaking. His eyes filled with tears, but he forced them back. He had learned tears only made her angrier. At the top of the stairs, Michael crouched low, hiding behind the railing. 14 years old, taller but not braver, he pressed his fist against his mouth to silence his breath. He wanted to rush down, to protect Daniel, but his legs wouldn't move. Fear kept him locked in place, guilt burning in his chest. "Clean it up," Karen ordered coldly, pointing at the shards. "And if I see another broken dish, you'll regret it." Her heels clacked as she left, the echo fading into another room. The silence afterward was heavier than her anger. Daniel bent slowly, picking up the broken pieces with trembling fingers. Each shard seemed to slice into his spirit, even though they never touched his skin. He swept them into the trash carefully, his lips pressed tight. Michael pressed his forehead against the railing, shame crawling up his neck. He hated himself for hiding. He had promised himself before that he would step in, that he would protect Daniel. But when the moment came, fear ruled again. The house seemed to hum with unease. The refrigerator buzzed steadily, the wall clock ticked too loudly, and outside a dog barked as if in the distance of another world. To the neighbors, the house looked ordinary, just another suburban home in America. No one would guess at the fear it contained. Daniel straightened the broom and put it away. His sleeve brushed across his damp cheeks. He didn't complain, didn't dare to. Complaints meant more trouble. Instead, he walked carefully toward his room, his small shoulders weighed down with silence. He had already learned to endure. Michael slipped quietly back into his own room, avoiding his brother's eyes. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, fists clenched. He told himself again that next time he would speak, but deep down he wasn't sure. The thought twisted in his stomach until it hurt. The day dimmed outside, shadows stretching long across the street. Inside, the two brothers carried their unspoken fears in different rooms, neither able to share the weight. Karen moved about the house like nothing had happened, humming faintly, her mask intact for when James came home. Daniel lay awake later, staring at the ceiling. A thought flickered faintly in his heart. Maybe one day his father would see, maybe Michael would speak up, maybe the bruises would stop. But tonight, silence was the only shield he had. The broken cup was gone, but its pieces remained inside him. And before Daniel's journey continues, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell carries lessons of strength, survival, and the power to overcome. And you won't want to miss what lies ahead. For now, the house settled into night, pretending to be normal. Yet beneath the stillness, a storm was forming, one that neither Daniel nor Michael would be able to ignore forever. James pulled his truck into the driveway just after dark, the headlights sweeping across the lawn before cutting off. The rumble of the engine faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet for a family with 2 boys. He stepped through the door, carrying the faint smell of motor oil on his jacket, his boots worn from another long day at the garage. "Hey, I'm home," James called, his voice carrying a tired warmth. Karen appeared almost instantly from the living room, smiling with practiced ease. "You're just in time, dinner's ready," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She wore that smile only when he was around, the one that suggested everything was under control. Daniel sat at the table already, hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes focused on his plate, though it was still empty. Michael came down the stairs slowly, his shoulders stiff, pretending not to notice his brother's silence. James looked between them, his brow furrowing slightly. "Everyone good?" he asked. Karen laughed lightly. "Of course, the boys behaved, didn't you?" She glanced at Daniel with a warning look masked as a smile. Daniel nodded quickly, though his chest tightened with the lie. Dinner passed with forced conversation. James talked about a customer who had tried to argue over the price of a repair. Karen filled the silence with comments about the neighbors, the new family who had moved in down the street, and the upcoming school fundraiser. She played the part of the attentive wife flawlessly, her voice smooth and light. Michael pushed food around his plate, his appetite gone. Every time he looked at Daniel, he felt the same surge of guilt. His brother's sleeve covered the faint red mark on his arm, but Michael knew it was there. The knowledge gnawed at him, making it hard to swallow even a bite. James reached for his glass of water, watching his sons quietly. Something about the stiffness between them, the way Daniel barely spoke, made his chest tighten, but he shook it off. Karen had always said Daniel was shy, that he kept to himself. Maybe it was just his nature. Later that night, James sat in the living room with the television on low. Karen curled beside him, chatting casually about bills and schedules. Upstairs, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The muffled sounds of the TV reached him faintly, a reminder that his father was near yet still so far. He wanted to go down to tell him everything, but fear pressed him flat against the mattress. In the next room, Michael sat at his desk, pretending to work on homework. His pen hovered over the page without moving. He thought about what he had seen, about the look in Daniel's eyes, and about the way Karen's smile shifted when James entered. He wanted to believe his father could see through it, that one day he'd realize the truth. But night after night the pattern repeated. Karen charming, James tired, Daniel silent. And Michael kept his secret too. The house seemed to run on two versions of reality, one polished for James, the other hidden in bruises and whispered apologies. It was a careful balance Karen maintained, and so far it had worked, but the cracks were there, faint but spreading. As James turned off the TV and kissed Karen goodnight, Daniel finally drifted into restless sleep. Michael stared at the dark ceiling, fists clenched, promising himself he would not stay silent forever. The next day would bring its own challenges, and the tension within the family would only grow harder to ignore. The morning began with the scent of toast and the sound of the school bus brakes outside. Daniel sat at the edge of the couch with his backpack hugged tightly to his chest, waiting for Karen's signal that he could leave. She stood near the counter with her coffee cup, watching him with sharp eyes. When she finally nodded, he bolted out the door, relief rushing over him as the fresh air hit his face. The bus ride was short, filled with chatter and laughter from other kids. Daniel sat by the window, his head resting against the glass, letting the noise wash over him. He felt safer there, tucked into a moving crowd where Karen's voice couldn't reach. Yet even here, isolation lingered. A few classmates glanced at him, but quickly turned back to their conversations. He wasn't the type of boy who got invited into the circle of jokes or games. At school, the routine unfolded with familiar precision. The Pledge of Allegiance, the scrape of chairs against linoleum floors, the rustle of notebooks. For Daniel, school was both an escape and a reminder of everything he lacked. He liked the structure, the rhythm of math problems and spelling words, but he also dreaded the moments when attention might land on him. During recess, kids ran across the playground, their sneakers pounding against the blacktop, laughter echoing across the yard. Daniel sat on the bench, tracing circles on the wood with his finger. Two boys from his class whispered to each other nearby. "He never plays," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "He's weird." The words stung, but Daniel stayed quiet, pretending not to hear. Inside the classroom, Ms. Harris noticed. She had been teaching long enough to recognize the quiet ones, the children who seemed to fold inward instead of reaching out. She also noticed the faint discoloration near Daniel's wrist when his sleeve slipped back. Her heart tightened, but she chose her approach carefully. "Daniel," she said gently as she passed his desk, Your handwriting is getting stronger. You've been practicing, haven't you? Daniel looked up, surprised, then nodded quickly. A small smile flickered before fading again. Miss Harris wanted to ask more, to press about the marks she had glimpsed, but she knew children carried secrets carefully guarded. Pushing too hard might close him off further. Still, she made a mental note. Watch closer. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with noise, trays clattering, voices rising in 100 conversations. Daniel sat at the edge of a table, unpacking his lunch slowly. His sandwich was simple, the crust still on, a reminder that Karen never bothered with small details. Across the room, Michael sat with a group of older kids. Their eyes met briefly, just a flicker, before Michael turned away. Daniel understood. His brother didn't want attention, didn't want anyone to know. The distance hurt, but Daniel didn't blame him. Later that afternoon, gym class brought another challenge. The smell of sneakers and polished wood filled the air as kids lined up for basketball drills. Daniel lagged behind, his movements slower, cautious. His body carried the soreness from home, though he tried to hide it. When the ball was tossed his way, he caught it but fumbled the pass. Laughter rippled through the line. His cheeks burned, and he lowered his head, wishing to disappear. Miss Harris watched again, her eyes narrowing. Something about the boy's hunched shoulders, the way he moved as though protecting himself, spoke louder than words. She wasn't sure yet, but her concern grew. For Daniel, the day stretched long. School was a refuge where Karen's voice couldn't reach, yet it was also a mirror that reflected his loneliness. He carried both feelings home with him, the hope that someone saw him and the fear that no one ever truly would. And as he climbed the bus steps at the end of the day, he couldn't shake the thought that his secrets were getting harder to hide. The next evening, the hum of the garage door signaled James's return. Daniel was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his homework spread before him, pencil resting in his hand. He stiffened when he heard the sound of boots against the floor. His father's presence should have meant safety, but lately it only made him anxious, worried that Karen's smile would cover the truth once again. James set his keys on the counter and gave his son a weary smile. "Hey, champ." "Working hard." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. "Math," he whispered. James reached to ruffle his hair, but stopped when his eyes caught a glimpse of Daniel's arm as the sleeve slipped back. A faint mark, yellow and blue at the edges, peeked from beneath the fabric. His smile faltered. "What happened there?" he asked, voice sharper than before. Daniel froze. His heart pounded as he pulled his sleeve down quickly. I fell at school," he murmured. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but fear pressed it out anyway. Before James could respond, Karen walked in carrying a dish towel. "Oh, that," she said smoothly, her voice light. "He tripped running up the playground steps, didn't you, Daniel?" Her eyes locked on him, sharp beneath the surface of her smile. Daniel nodded quickly, barely breathing. "Yeah." James studied them both, unease stirring in his chest. Karen's tone was cheerful, but something in Daniel's eyes, something quiet and pleading, made him pause. Still, exhaustion weighed on him, and the doubts slipped back under the surface. "You've got to be more careful," he muttered, forcing a smile as he moved toward the fridge. Michael stood at the doorway, having heard enough to know exactly what had happened. His fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to tell his father the truth, but the image of Karen's glare held him silent. He hated himself for it. Later that night, Daniel lay in his bed, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. His arm throbbed where Karen had struck him, though he tried to ignore it. More painful than the bruise was the memory of his father's eyes, searching and uncertain. He had wanted to tell him. The words had sat on his tongue, but fear kept them locked away. Across the hall, Michael sat awake, guilt burning hotter than ever. He replayed the scene in his mind, the lie Daniel told, the way Karen twisted it with ease and their father's hesitation. He whispered to himself, "I should have said something." But he hadn't, and the weight of his silence pressed down on him. James, in his room with Karen beside him, couldn't shake the image of his son's arm. He stared at the ceiling long after she had fallen asleep, the sound of the clock ticking louder with each second. Something wasn't adding up. He wanted to believe the story, wanted to trust that the house he came home to was steady and safe. Yet, the doubt gnawed at him, quiet but persistent. The house seemed filled with secrets that night. Each person carried their own, Daniel with his bruises, Michael with his guilt, James with his suspicions, and Karen with her lies. The silence between them grew heavier, filling the spaces where truth should have lived. Daniel curled deeper under his blanket, whispering to himself words no one else could hear. Maybe tomorrow will be better. But even he didn't believe it. The bruise faded slowly over the next days, but the memory lingered fresh. And with each glance exchanged in the quiet halls of the house, the truth pushed harder against the walls of silence, waiting for the moment it would finally break through. Saturday morning carried the smell of pancakes drifting through the house, but the warmth of breakfast never reached Daniel. He sat at the kitchen table with his fork in hand, careful not to spill even a drop of syrup. Karen moved briskly around the kitchen, her eyes sharp as she placed a stack of dishes onto the counter. The tension in her shoulders made Daniel shrink smaller in his chair. When the fork slipped and clattered against the plate, Karen's head snapped toward him. "Can't you do anything right?" she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his cheeks flushing. "Sorry doesn't fix clumsy," she hissed, stepping closer. Michael, leaning against the doorway, swallowed hard. He had been watching all morning, waiting for the moment her anger would ignite. His jaw clenched as Karen towered over his little brother, her voice cutting deeper than any strike. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the table, gripping the edge of his plate with trembling fingers. He wished he could disappear, wished the ground would swallow him whole. Karen's voice rose again. "You're 9 years old and you still act like a baby. Do you want your father to think I can't manage this house? Do you want him to see how useless you are?" "Stop," Michael said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. His heart pounded as all eyes turned to him. Karen's expression hardened. "What did you say?" "I said stop." His voice shook, but he didn't back down. He didn't do anything wrong. It was just a fork. For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. Daniel's eyes widened, fear and hope clashing in his chest. Michael had never dared to speak up before. Karen stepped closer to her stepson, her eyes narrowing. "Don't you dare talk back to me in this house. You think you're old enough to challenge me? You're not." Her tone dripped with warning. Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body tense. "You don't have to treat him like that," he muttered, voice lower but still firm. Karen leaned in, her words sharp and venomous. "If you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut. Don't forget you can end up in trouble too." The air felt heavy, pressing down on them. Michael wanted to say more, wanted to shout the truth that burned inside him, but fear gripped his chest. He glanced at Daniel, who shook his head slightly, silently begging him not to push further. Karen finally turned away, muttering under her breath as she slammed a pan into the sink. The sound echoed through the kitchen, making Daniel flinch. Michael stayed in the doorway, his body buzzing with adrenaline. He hated the way his legs trembled, hated how small he still felt, even after speaking up. But deep down, a spark had been lit. He had crossed a line, even if it was only with words. Later, at dinner, the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. The table was set neatly, food laid out carefully, but no one spoke much. James sat at the head, tired from another long day, unaware of the storm that had swept through only hours earlier. Karen smiled, spoke lightly about errands and chores, as though nothing had happened. Daniel chewed slowly, keeping his eyes on his plate. Michael stared at the food without tasting it, his mind replaying the confrontation again and again. He knew it wasn't enough. He hadn't truly stopped her, but for the first time he hadn't stayed completely silent either, and as the meal dragged on under forced calm, both brothers knew one thing. The fragile balance in the house was shifting, and soon it would break. Sunday afternoon in their neighborhood looked like a postcard. Lawns were trimmed neatly, the scent of barbecue drifted through the air, and children rode bikes up and down the quiet streets. Families gathered on porches with iced tea in hand, waving at passing cars. It was the kind of suburban scene people imagined when they thought of safety, stability, and belonging. Karen stepped outside with a smile that looked effortless, though Daniel knew how carefully it was practiced. "Hi, Susan," she called cheerfully to the neighbor across the street. "We should get together soon. Maybe a cookout?" Susan smiled back, unaware of the storm brewing behind Karen's walls. "That sounds wonderful." Daniel stood behind his stepmother, his posture stiff. She rested a hand lightly on his shoulder, squeezing just enough to remind him to keep still. To anyone watching, she looked like a doting parent. To Daniel, the touch felt like a warning. At church that morning, Karen had been equally convincing, chatting with other women about volunteer work and casseroles for the next community dinner. People admired how put together she seemed, how she managed the home while James worked long hours. Daniel kept quiet in his seat, eyes fixed on the hymn book, while Michael shifted uncomfortably beside him, hating the show of perfection. Later that week, the school fair buzzed with energy. Games, music, raffle tickets being sold under a tent. Michael drifted among his classmates, but his mind wasn't on the booths or the cotton candy. He kept glancing toward Daniel, who stood near the ring toss, hands in his pockets, too shy to join in. "Hey, man," said Ethan, one of Michael's closest friends, nudging him. "Your little brother okay? He looks, I don't know, kind of down." Michael hesitated, chewing on his lip. He wanted to say everything, that Daniel was more than down, that he was hurting, that home wasn't what people thought, but the words caught in his throat. "He's just shy," Michael muttered instead. Ethan studied him. "You've been different too. If something's wrong, you can talk to me, you know." The sincerity in his friend's voice made Michael's chest ache. He kicked at the grass. "It's complicated." Ethan didn't push, but before they parted ways, he added quietly, "Sometimes telling someone makes it less complicated." That night, Michael sat at his desk, staring at his textbooks, Ethan's words echoing in his mind. He thought about Ms. Harris, about the way she seemed to notice Daniel more than the others did. Maybe she would believe him. Maybe someone finally would. Still, the thought of exposing Karen terrified him. The threats she had whispered in the kitchen were enough to keep him silent. Meanwhile, Daniel lay in bed listening to the faint sounds of laughter from the neighbor's backyard. The hum of voices, the strum of a guitar, and the crackle of a fire pit drifted through his open window. He imagined being there, sitting in the glow, eating a marshmallow without fear. He imagined what it would feel like to live in a house where laughter was real, not a mask for secrets. The world outside seemed bright and welcoming, but for Daniel and Michael it felt just out of reach. Their home stood among others on the street, identical in paint and siding, yet worlds apart in truth. And as Karen continued to polish her facade, the brothers wondered how long the silence inside could hold. Michael lay awake later that night, a decision forming slowly, like the first crack in ice. He wasn't ready to act, not yet. But the seed of change had been planted, and it wouldn't be ignored forever. The gym smelled of rubber soles and polished wood, the air buzzing with the shouts of kids waiting their turn for relay races. Daniel stood near the back of the line, his small frame bent slightly, as though he were trying to fold himself into invisibility. The whistle blew, sneakers pounded the floor, and laughter bounced across the walls. When his turn came, Daniel took off at a run, clutching the baton. His legs moved awkwardly, his chest already tight. He had been up most of the night, the dull ache in his ribs making it hard to rest. He pushed himself harder, determined not to draw attention. But halfway across the court, his vision blurred. The baton slipped, clattering onto the floor as Daniel stumbled forward and collapsed. Gasps filled the gym. The coach blew the whistle again, rushing over. "Daniel, you all right, son?" Daniel tried to push himself up, but pain spread through his side, sharp and unrelenting. His face flushed with embarrassment as other students stared. He mumbled, "I'm fine," though his voice was weak. The coach wasn't convinced. He helped Daniel to his feet and guided him toward the nurse's office, the gym falling silent in their wake. Michael, standing at the edge of the bleachers, felt his stomach twist. He knew exactly why his brother had fallen, but the thought of speaking up froze him again. In the nurse's office, the fluorescent lights hummed softly. Nurse Bradley examined Daniel carefully, her brow furrowing when she noticed the faint bruises along his ribs. "These don't look like something from just a fall," she said gently. Daniel's pulse quickened. He shook his head quickly. "I tripped. It was the stairs last week." His voice came out too rehearsed, too quick. Nurse Bradley exchanged a glance with the coach, who had stayed by the door. "Daniel," she said softly, kneeling so her eyes met his, "you can tell me if something's going on. You won't be in trouble." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her, to let the truth spill out and finally be free, but the image of Karen's cold eyes flashed in his mind. He shook his head again. "I just fall a lot." The nurse didn't push further, but she made notes. "We'll keep an eye on this," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "I'll let your teacher know you need to take it easy." Word spread quickly among the students that Daniel had collapsed. By the time he returned to class, whispers followed him like shadows. Some children looked at him with pity, others with curiosity. Daniel kept his gaze down, wishing he could vanish into the floor. That evening at home, Karen's fury erupted. "Do you realize what you've done?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Collapsing in gym class? Do you know how embarrassing that is for this family?" Daniel's chest tightened. "I didn't mean—" "Don't you dare talk back," she snapped. Her eyes narrowed, and the threat in her expression silenced him. Michael watched from the hallway, his heart racing. His fists clenched as he listened to Karen scold Daniel for something that wasn't his fault. He wanted to shout that it wasn't embarrassment, it was pain, but again, fear chained him. That night, James noticed how quiet Daniel was at the dinner table, how little food he touched. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, concern flickering in his voice. Daniel forced a small smile. "Just tired." James studied him for a moment longer but said nothing. Karen's pleasant chatter filled the silence, weaving another mask for him to accept. Yet James's doubt grew heavier, lingering long after the plates were cleared. Daniel lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, his body aching but his spirit hurting more. At school, someone had noticed, even if he couldn't tell them the truth. And that thought alone kept a small spark alive inside him. Someone was watching, and maybe, just maybe, they cared. Michael sat on the edge of his bed that night, his textbooks spread open, but untouched. The glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows on the posters taped to the wall, basketball players mid-jump, a rock band frozen in time. His mind wasn't on algebra or history, it was on Daniel. He could still hear the thud of his little brother hitting the gym floor, still see the pale look on his face when Karen hissed at him afterward. The door creaked open softly. Daniel stood there in his pajamas, holding his pillow against his chest. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the air vent. "Can I stay in here tonight?" Michael's heart clenched. He nodded. "Yeah, come on." Daniel climbed onto the bed, curling up under the blanket. The silence stretched between them until Michael finally whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier." Daniel shook his head. "It's not your fault." "It feels like it is," Michael muttered. He stared at the ceiling, anger and guilt twisting inside him. "I should have told Dad. I should have told someone. But every time I try, I freeze up. I hate it." Daniel's small voice broke through the dark. "If you tell, she'll hurt you too." His words carried both fear and resignation, as though he had already accepted the rules of their world. Michael turned on his side, facing his brother. "I don't care about me. I hate seeing you like this." His voice cracked, frustration pushing against the edges of his control. Daniel stayed quiet, his eyes glossy in the dim light. Michael reached over and pulled him close, the way he used to when they were younger, and thunder scared Daniel at night. They lay there listening to the faint sound of cars passing outside, the ordinary rhythm of the world continuing, as if nothing inside their house was wrong. Later, when Daniel's breathing evened into sleep, Michael remained awake. His mind replayed every moment of the past weeks, the broken cup, the bruise his father almost questioned, the collapse in gym class. Each memory stacked like heavy stones on his chest. His phone buzzed softly on the desk. A text from Ethan lit the screen. "You good? Been thinking about what we talked about." Michael stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "Not really, but I can't explain right now. He set the phone down and ran his hands through his hair. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to break through the silence that trapped them. But instead he stayed still, holding the weight inside. The next morning, the smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen. Michael walked downstairs with Daniel trailing behind him. Karen stood at the counter, humming lightly as though the night before had never happened. Her eyes flicked toward them, cool and sharp, before softening as James entered the room. Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He wanted to challenge her, to strip away the mask she wore so easily, but the risk felt too high. Instead, he sat beside Daniel at the table, nudging his brother's juice toward him with a small, reassuring smile. Daniel looked up, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. In that glance, Michael promised silently, "I won't let you face this alone anymore." Though he hadn't spoken the truth out loud yet, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. The courage was still fragile, like a flame fighting against wind, but it was there. And he knew one day it would burn too brightly to be hidden, for now he carried that silent strength quietly, waiting for the moment it would finally matter. James sat at his workbench in the garage, the smell of oil and metal filling the space. He should have been focused on rebuilding a carburetor, but his mind kept drifting. Images of Daniel's tired eyes and the fading bruise on his arm haunted him. Something wasn't right. He had always trusted Karen's explanations, but lately those words rang hollow. That evening, when he returned from work, the house was quieter than usual. Karen greeted him with her usual smile, the same polished warmth she always wore when he stepped through the door. But as Daniel crossed the hallway with his backpack, James noticed the way the boy flinched slightly when Karen's hand brushed his shoulder. "Homework already, buddy?" James asked gently. Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, Dad." He didn't meet his eyes. James's chest tightened. After dinner, he walked past the laundry room and spotted a shirt crumpled in the corner. He bent to pick it up, only to notice faint stains near the sleeve, marks that looked more like smudges from the floor than grass or dirt. He turned the fabric over in his hands, unease gnawing deeper. At work the next day, while he leaned under the hood of a customer's truck, his co-worker Mike nudged him. "You all right, man? You've been spaced out lately." James sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's the kids, Daniel especially. He's always quiet, but lately, I don't know, something feels off." Mike tilted his head. "You think something's happening at home?" The question made James stiffen. He hated even considering it. "Karen says he's just clumsy. But—" He trailed off, remembering the way Daniel pulled his sleeve down so quickly, the way Michael's eyes lingered on his brother when he thought no one noticed. "Listen," Mike said, lowering his voice. "My niece went through something like that once. Everyone brushed it off as accidents until a teacher stepped in. Don't ignore the signs." The words stayed with James long after the conversation ended. That evening he lingered in the driveway before going inside, staring at the warm glow of the living room windows. The house looked perfect from the outside, just like all the others on the street. But inside he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was festering. At dinner, James watched more closely. Daniel barely touched his food, pushing peas around the plate. Michael sat stiffly, answering questions with one-word responses. Karen carried the conversation smoothly, talking about errands and neighborhood gossip, never missing a beat. "So, Daniel," James said suddenly, breaking the rhythm, "anything interesting happen at school today?" Daniel's fork froze in midair. Just math tests." His voice was too soft, too rehearsed. Karen chimed in quickly. "He's doing well, aren't you, honey?" She placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder again, her smile unwavering. James studied the exchange, doubt pressing harder. After dinner, he lingered in the kitchen, pretending to rinse dishes while he listened. From the hallway, he heard Michael's voice whispering to Daniel, low but urgent. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was protective, almost desperate. That night, lying awake in bed, James stared at the ceiling. His wife breathed evenly beside him, but his thoughts churned. He had ignored too many small things, too many moments that didn't add up. The bruises, the flinches, the silence between his sons. He could no longer convince himself it was all normal. He rolled onto his side, whispering to himself, "Something's going on, and I'm going to find out." For the first time, James's doubts outweighed his denial. And though he didn't yet know how, he was determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. Dinner started quietly that evening. The hum of the ceiling fan above filled the silence as James sat at the head of the table, weary from another long day. Daniel placed his glass of milk carefully beside his plate, his movements deliberate, as though any small mistake could unravel the fragile piece. Michael sat across from him, tense, his eyes shifting from his brother to Karen. Karen set the serving spoon back into the bowl with a forced brightness. "James, you'll be happy to know the lawn service is finally coming tomorrow. I told them you were too busy at the garage to worry about it." James gave a tired nod, his fork scraping against his plate. "That's fine." For a moment it almost seemed like any other night, but then Daniel's elbow nudged his glass too far. The milk tipped, spilling across the tablecloth in a pale wave that raced toward Karen's lap. The clatter of the glass hitting the table echoed louder than it should have. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. Karen shot up, her chair screeching against the floor. Her face hardened, eyes flashing. "Unbelievable," she hissed. "Can't you do anything without ruining it?" Daniel's lips trembled. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Sorry again?" She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Do you ever think about how much work I do? And you sit there making messes like a baby." Michael's chair scraped loudly as he stood. His heart pounded, but this time he didn't stay silent. "Enough!" Karen's head snapped toward him. "What did you just say? I said stop yelling at him." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his voice trembling but firm. "It was just milk. He didn't do it on purpose." Daniel's eyes widened, fear mixed with awe. He had never heard his brother speak to her like that. Karen stepped toward Michael, her expression cold, almost mocking. "How you think you can talk to me like that? You're just a child. Sit down before you regret opening your mouth." Michael's throat tightened, but he didn't move. His legs shook under the weight of his defiance, yet he held his ground. "He's my brother. I'm not going to let you treat him like this anymore." The room went still, the only sound the steady drip of milk hitting the floor. Daniel's heart raced, caught between terror for Michael and a flicker of hope that maybe this time things would change. And then the front door opened. James stepped into the dining room, his gaze falling instantly on the scene before him. He saw Karen standing rigid, Michael defiant, Daniel pale and shaking, and the spilled milk spreading across the table. "What's going on here?" His voice was sharp, carrying more authority than usual. Karen turned, her smile snapping back into place as though nothing had happened. "James, it was just an accident. The boys are overreacting." But James's eyes didn't leave her. He had walked in at the exact moment her anger flared, had caught the tone in her voice, the fear in his sons' faces. For the first time, he saw past the mask. Michael's chest rose and fell quickly. He wanted to speak, to tell everything right then, but the room felt suspended in fragile silence. Daniel lowered his gaze, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare move, but deep inside, a tiny spark of relief flickered. His father had finally seen something. The balance of their home had shifted. James's denial, once strong, had cracked wide open, and nothing would ever be the same again. The dining room sat in silence, the spilled milk seeping into the fabric of the tablecloth. James's gaze stayed locked on Karen, his jaw tight. For years he had brushed aside doubts, convincing himself that her sharp edges were only stress, that his boy's quietness was just shyness. But the picture before him, the fear etched on Daniel's face, the fire in Michael's eyes, left no room for excuses. "James?" Karen began quickly, her tone softening, desperate to regain control. "It wasn't what it looked like. I just raised my voice." "Kids exaggerate, you know how it is." Michael stepped forward, his voice shaking but clear. "She's lying." Daniel's breath caught. He glanced at his brother, terrified of what Karen might do if the truth spilled out, yet he couldn't look away. James turned to Michael, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She yells at him all the time. She hurts him. Michael's fists clenched, his words tumbling out faster now. That bruise on his arm, she did that. And she blames him for everything. I've seen it. Karen's face flushed red. That is not true, she snapped. Her voice cracked under the strain of her mask slipping. Michael, how dare you make up stories about me in front of your father? But James had already turned to Daniel. His youngest sat frozen, his small hands gripping the chair, tears filling his eyes. James knelt down beside him. Daniel, he said softly, look at me. Is it true? Daniel's lips trembled. He wanted to say no, to protect himself, to protect Michael. But the weight of silence had become too much. His whisper was barely audible. Yes. The word shattered the room. James's stomach dropped, a wave of guilt and rage crashing over him. How many times had he ignored the signs? How many nights had he believed Karen's words instead of his son's silence? He looked at Daniel, then at Michael, and finally at the woman standing before him. Karen folded her arms, her voice rising in panic. He's confused. Children make things up. They twist things to get attention. James, you can't seriously believe... Enough, James said sharply, his tone cutting through her protest. His eyes burned with fury. I don't want to hear another excuse, not one more. The silence that followed was suffocating. Karen's lips parted as if to argue again, but she caught the steel in his expression and stopped. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking as tears finally broke free. Michael moved quickly, wrapping an arm around him, whispering, It's okay. You're safe now. His own eyes stung, but he held firm, knowing this was the moment they had been waiting for. James stood slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of a chair. He had thought he was protecting his family by working long hours, by providing, by keeping the roof solid and the bills paid. But he had failed to see what was happening right in front of him. That failure gnawed at him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. Karen broke the silence at last, her voice cold. So what now? You're going to believe them over me. James's answer came without hesitation. I'm going to protect my sons, that's what's going to happen. The words hung in the air, final and immovable. Daniel lifted his head, his eyes red but glimmering with a fragile sense of hope. Michael tightened his hold on him, his heart racing with the realization that their father had finally seen. The storm had broken open, and nothing in their home would ever be the same again. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt different. The usual silence wasn't there. Instead, a thick tension clung to every corner. James sat at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold, his thoughts circling endlessly. He replayed Daniel's whisper, the quiet yes that had shattered everything. The weight of it pressed on him like a vice. Karen moved briskly around the kitchen, her tone clipped. So, what's your plan now? Are you going to ruin this family because of some childish exaggerations? James's eyes lifted slowly. Don't call them exaggerations, they're not lies. His voice carried a calm he didn't feel. Inside, fury and shame warred against each other. Michael entered the room cautiously, Daniel close behind him. Both boys froze when they saw their stepmother's glare. James motioned to them gently. Sit down. I need you both to hear this. Daniel slid into his chair, eyes downcast, while Michael kept his shoulders squared. I'm calling the school today, James said firmly. I want to speak with Daniel's teacher and the principal. We're going to get help. Karen slammed a pan into the sink, the clatter making Daniel flinch. You're blowing this out of proportion, James. Do you have any idea what people will think if you drag the school into this? You'll destroy our reputation. James stood, his voice rising now. I don't care about reputation, I care about my sons. The words cut the air clean. Karen's face tightened, her lips pressing into a hard line. That afternoon, James sat in the principal's office at the elementary school. Ms. Harris was already there, her eyes filled with concern. The principal folded his hands across the desk. Mr. Carter, we've had some concerns as well. Nurse Bradley documented injuries after Daniel collapsed in gym. And Ms. Harris has shared observations that worry us. James's throat tightened. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? Ms. Harris leaned forward. We wanted to be sure. These situations are delicate. But Mr. Carter, your son shows signs of fear and of hiding pain. Daniel sat in the chair beside his father, his small hands twisting together in his lap. James reached out, placing his large hand over his son's. You don't have to hide anymore, he whispered. The principal nodded solemnly. We're obligated to report this. Child Protective Services will be contacted. They'll likely visit your home, speak to you and your sons. Karen's fury exploded later when she learned. How dare you drag outsiders into this house, she shouted. You're betraying me, James. James's reply was steady. No, I'm protecting my children. If you can't see that, then you've lost your place here. Michael stood near the staircase, his heart racing as he listened. For the first time, he saw his father choosing them, standing against Karen instead of beside her. Relief and fear tangled inside him. That evening, the knock on the door came. A woman with a clipboard introduced herself as a social worker from Child Protective Services. Her tone was professional but kind as she asked to speak with Daniel and Michael privately. Daniel's voice was quiet, but little by little, the truth began to come out. He described the yelling, the punishments, the bruises he tried to hide. Michael added his own words, his voice firmer now, backing his brother with every detail. James sat listening, his fists clenched, guilt burning deeper with every revelation. He had been blind for too long, but now he swore he would never be blind again. When the social worker left, the house no longer felt like Karen's domain. It felt like a battleground shifting sides. For the first time, Daniel and Michael weren't completely alone. The path ahead would not be easy, but the truth was no longer buried, and truth, once spoken, had the power to change everything. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. Karen was no longer in the house. Her belongings were still there, a jacket on a hook, a pair of shoes by the door. But her presence was gone, and with it, the constant weight of fear. The silence now was different. It was softer, almost gentle, though the wounds it covered were still raw. Daniel walked through the hallway cautiously, as if expecting her voice to cut through at any moment. When it didn't, his shoulders eased just a little. Michael stayed close to him, protective in ways that no 14-year-old should have to be, but also proud that he could finally do something real for his brother. James had taken a few days off work, something he hadn't done in years. He knew his sons needed more than a paycheck, they needed him. He sat with them at the kitchen table that first morning, bowls of cereal in front of them, sunlight spilling across the worn tablecloth. I need to say something, James began, his voice low. I should have seen this sooner. I should have protected you both. And I didn't. I'm sorry. Daniel's spoon paused in his hand. He looked up, eyes wide. Apologies were rare in his world. Michael gave a small nod, his throat tight. James continued, I can't change what happened, but I promise I'll never ignore you again. You'll always be safe with me. The boys didn't answer right away, but the promise lingered in the air, a fragile thread beginning to mend what had been broken. In the days that followed, neighbors stopped by. Susan from across the street brought over a casserole and a soft smile. If you ever need anything, we're here, she told James, then bent to Daniel's level. And you, sweetheart, you've got a whole community looking out for you now. At church, people offered prayers and support. Michael felt embarrassed at first, hating the whispers, but then he realized they weren't whispers of pity. They were words of encouragement, people acknowledging their strength. For the first time, he didn't feel completely alone in carrying the truth. James also met with a counselor recommended by Child Protective Services. He brought Daniel and Michael to the small office with posters of nature scenes and shelves of toys meant to make children feel comfortable. The counselor, Mrs. Lopez, spoke gently, explaining that healing takes time, but time could also be a gift. Daniel sat quietly at first, unsure of how much to say, but as the weeks went on, he found small ways to open up. He talked about feeling scared, about holding his breath when footsteps came near. Michael admitted his guilt, how he had stayed hidden when he wanted to protect his brother. Mrs. Lopez listened to both, guiding them toward understanding that what had happened wasn't their fault. At home, new routines began to take root. Dinner was simpler now, but lighter too, laughter slowly finding its way back into the room. James insisted on family time, whether it was a board game on Friday night or watching a baseball game together. Daniel started drawing again, sketching with crayons at the kitchen table, while Michael worked on homework beside him. One evening, as the boys sat in the backyard watching fireflies blink in the grass, Daniel whispered, "Do you think it's really over?" Michael looked at him, the weight in his eyes softened by determination. "Yeah, because Dad sees it now. And because I won't let it happen again." Daniel nodded, leaning his head on his brother's shoulder. For the first time in a long while, he believed him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the foundation had shifted. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was becoming something new, a place where healing, however slow, could begin. The weeks turned into months, and little by little, Daniel began to change. The house no longer felt like a cage. The air seemed lighter, the shadows less menacing. He still carried the memories of what had happened, but he no longer carried them alone. James made therapy a priority. Every Tuesday afternoon, Daniel and Michael sat with Mrs. Lopez in her small office, decorated with bright rugs and shelves filled with puzzles. At first, Daniel barely spoke, answering with nods or one-word replies. But over time, his voice grew steadier. "I used to think it was my fault," he admitted one afternoon, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. Mrs. Lopez leaned forward. "It wasn't your fault, Daniel. Nothing you did caused what happened." Michael, sitting beside him, added, "She always tried to make him believe it was, but it wasn't. It never was." Daniel looked at his brother, the weight in his chest easing slightly. For the first time, he began to believe the words. At school, Miss Harris continued to watch over him. She noticed he raised his hand more often now, his voice no longer disappearing at the sound of laughter. When he solved a math problem correctly, she smiled warmly. "See, Daniel? I knew you could." During recess, he began to join in games of tag, his sneakers pounding the blacktop with a freedom he hadn't felt in years. Some classmates still teased occasionally, but he no longer shrank away as quickly. He had Michael's words echoing in his mind. "You're not alone anymore." One Saturday morning, James surprised the boys with new baseball gloves. "Thought we could try Little League," he said, his smile tentative. Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? Play baseball?" "Of course," James replied. "You'll love it, and I'll be there to cheer you on." The first practice was nerve-wracking. The field stretched wide under the summer sun, the smell of freshly cut grass filling the air. Daniel stood awkwardly at first, the glove too big on his hand. But when the coach tossed him a ball and he caught it cleanly, cheers erupted from the other kids. A shy smile tugged at his lips. Michael clapped from the sidelines. "That's my brother!" he shouted, pride shining in his voice. In that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time. Confidence. Each practice built on the last, his throws growing sharper, his swings more sure. And every time he looked to the stands, his father was there clapping and calling his name. At night, when Daniel sat at his desk sketching baseballs and bats with his crayons, he felt a new kind of energy. The bruises had faded from his skin, but more importantly, they were beginning to fade from his spirit. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was growing. One evening, after a long practice, Daniel sat on the porch steps beside his brother. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and the air was thick with the smell of cut grass. "Do you think I'm getting better?" he asked. Michael grinned. "You're more than better. You're stronger than most kids I know, and not just at baseball." Daniel's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. "I couldn't have done it without you." Michael nudged him playfully. "You're the one doing it, Daniel. I just reminded you that you could." As the night deepened, Daniel leaned back, gazing at the stars scattered above. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel terrifying. It felt open, full of possibilities waiting to be reached. He still had scars, but he was no longer defined by them. He was learning to live, to trust, and to dream again. Autumn arrived with cool air and golden leaves swirling across the quiet street. For the first time in years, the Carter household no longer felt like a place of dread. The walls that had once echoed with fear now carried the sounds of laughter, the shuffle of board games and the steady hum of normal family life. James sat on the porch one evening, watching Daniel and Michael toss a baseball back and forth in the yard. Their laughter rose into the fading light, the kind of sound that made his chest ache with both pride and regret. He thought about all the time he had spent blind, all the nights he came home too tired to notice what his sons were hiding. When Daniel ran up to him, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, James reached out and pulled him close. "You're stronger than I ever realized," he said softly. Daniel leaned into his father's side, his voice small but certain. "I feel stronger now." Michael joined them, glove still in hand. He looked at his father with a seriousness that didn't quite fit his age. "You didn't just protect him, Dad. You protected both of us. We needed that." James's throat tightened. "I should have done it sooner. I'll always regret that." "But you did it," Michael replied firmly. "And that's what matters." The words settled between them like a promise. At school, Daniel continued to grow. Miss Harris praised his progress, and for the first time, he seemed to believe her. He read aloud in class without trembling, joined his friends in games at recess, and wore his Little League cap with pride. His scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. Therapy sessions with Mrs. Lopez became less about pain and more about growth. Daniel talked about his dreams, wanting to play baseball, to draw, even to become a teacher one day. Michael admitted he wanted to study hard enough to get into college, to prove to himself that he could build a different future. One Sunday after church, Susan, the neighbor, stopped James as they walked to the car. "I just want to say your boys look so much happier," she said warmly. "Whatever you're doing, keep at it." James smiled, the weight in his heart easing slightly. "We're just trying to rebuild, one day at a time." That night, the three of them sat at the kitchen table over plates of spaghetti. Daniel twirled noodles on his fork, his eyes flicking between his father and brother. "Do you think things will stay good now?" he asked carefully. James reached across the table, his hand resting on Daniel's. "Yes, because from now on, we face everything together." Michael nodded. "We're a team, and teams don't break apart." Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. For him, that promise was more valuable than anything else. As the evening wound down, the boys worked on homework while James cleaned the kitchen. He paused for a moment, looking around the room. It wasn't perfect. There were still bills on the counter, still scars to heal, but it was theirs. And for the first time in years, it felt like home. The past could never be erased, but the future was being rewritten with every laugh, every hug, every small act of courage. Daniel had transformed from a boy defined by fear into one discovering his own strength. Michael had grown into a protector, no longer silent, no longer hiding. And James had become the father they needed, not just a provider, but a presence, steady and unyielding. Their story wasn't about what had broken them, but about how they rebuilt. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and hope. And don't forget to click the video on your screen now. You'll want to see where the next journey takes us, because sometimes the darkest stories lead to the brightest endings.